Hi, everyone. So for those of you that haven't met me yet, in some form or another, I'm Caroline, and I'm the head TA for both the cognition and the perception courses this semester. And I'm here today to tell you a little bit about what will probably come to be one of the most crucial aspects of the course. And this is what's known as the QDAFI method. So the QDAFI method is a published method of reading a scientific paper, and it's actually brought to you by one of our own, Pascal Wallish, who's currently an instructor in both the psychology and the Center for Data Science departments here at NYU. And like I said, the QDAFI method is arguably one of the most valuable skills that you'll learn not only in this course, but maybe even in your entire undergraduate career. I remember when I learned the skill, thank gosh, like 6 years ago, I still use it to this day. So it will be incredibly valuable for you as you kind of progress throughout your academic career and beyond. So what even is the QDAFI? Well, the QDAFI method, just like any other method, is just that. It's a method and it's a skill. Essentially, the QDAFI method allows us to extract the most relevant information from a paper while not ignoring, but integrating other aspects that might be more confusing or less relevant, right? And the QDAFI method allows you to focus on what's called the gist of a paper. It also provides a framework for you to really kind of get in there and figure out what's actually important. It's also a tool. And just like any other tool, it will allow you to assume a certain position, right? And in this case, you will assume the position of an active consumer. If you master this method, you'll be able to interact with research articles and academic work directly, right? You yourself. You won't need to necessarily rely on a third party to kind of translate that work for you. You can get in there and be your own kind of scientist, researcher, and scholar. If any of you guys learned about primary or secondary work in, maybe middle school or high school, you'll recall pretty easily that sources do matter. And as they say, history is generally written by the victor. Well, in our case, that victor is often a textbook editor, right? So the QDAFI method gives you this opportunity to interact directly with the text and with these primary sources in a way that's both doable and makes sense. It's also a tool for you as a non-expert to interact with scientific literature written by experts, right? Research papers are written by experts and they're written for experts. And for those of you that are familiar with the replication crisis, whether it be in psychology or other social or biological sciences, you'll know that now more than ever, right, science needs to be reproducible. And in other words, many other empirical papers and scientific papers are designed such that other scientists can get in there, read the paper, and reproduce the experiment to a T, right? This is great for open science. This is great. It's totally a step in the right direction, but it also presents a bit of a challenge to unfamiliar readers, right? One consequence is that papers, especially in the cognitive, psychological, neurosciences, can be overly technical. So it really, really helps to have a method like this that allows you to kind of get in there as the reader and isolate what actually matters. And lastly, this is a learned skill, right? It will take time and it will take practice, just like any other skill. I look back at QDAFIs that I wrote 5-6 years ago, and I say, wow, I've come so far. I didn't get great grades on those papers, but it was okay because I learned over time to kind of develop this and work through it so that now I can be an active consumer of scientific literature. What isn't the QDAFI? Well, it's not an abstract. Many of you that are familiar with scientific papers have seen abstracts. Abstracts are essentially short, kind of summary-like pieces, usually around 300 to 400 words, that compress and condense the author's work. But the point of the QDAFI is also to engage with the paper, right? Like I said, to be an active consumer. So you're going to find that most sections of the QDAFI can't really be answered just by copying the abstract. They just can't. It's also not a detailed book summary, right? So over time, and we're going to talk about memory a lot in this course, is a really crucial cognitive function, but over time, memories become transformed. You're not necessarily going to remember every aspect of a paper, nor is it necessarily beneficial to, right? Brevity is key, and we're here to kind of make sure of this. Each section that you should submit should be around 2 sentences, more or less. Any more, and you really run the risk of missing the forest for the trees, so to speak. For this reason, the QDAFI is not a detailed summary. It's also not this sort of medieval torture device that we're inflicting upon you to kind of give you busy work in any sense. This is really for you. We pick these papers after hours and hours of, arguing and going over really, really amazing papers that are seminal, really, really critical to the field. These papers are the best of the best. They're super high caliber. And they're designed to introduce you to scientific research and writing in a hands-on, fun, and also informative and relevant way. So what's actually at stake for you guys, right? Well, firstly, independence. Like I said, research papers by experts for experts, for the most part. For those of you that are familiar with, like I said, the replication crisis, this all kind of makes sense. But this also presents itself as a challenge to you as a consumer. By mastering this method, you can actually go in and extract the relevant information as you yourself would. Also time, right? This is supposed to save you time in the long run. If you plan to stay in this field, and really even if you don't, you're going to look back at these papers again, right? These are really, really critical seminal works. Instead of going back and reading an entire 15 or 20 page paper, you can just go back and look at this little, 1 page, half a page snapshot and get the relevant gist without kind of digging back through all of that information again. And also long-term benefits. Unlike, trading that you guys are probably doing on Robinhood, the QDAFI method is all about long-term profit and long-term retention, right? We're going to talk a lot about memory. We're going to talk a lot about memory retention, but a lot of literature suggests that over time, you're going to lose these specific details, and what you'll be left with is kind of the gist. That is the point of the QDAFI, right? To isolate that gist. What you should be aiming for, first and foremost, you should be aiming for brevity, right? Like I said, over time, memories are going to become compressed. They're going to drift towards this good gestalt, which we'll talk a little bit about when we talk about really fun things like the Mandela effect. But keeping that input simple really helps. You're not going to remember it all anyways. It's generally impossible. So you want to focus on what you'll actually remember, or at least what you would like to remember, right? Also, clarity. This is for you. It needs to be clear. You need to be able to look back in 4 or 5 years and understand what you were trying to say, right? Don't be vague, be as specific as possible, but focus on what really matters. And lastly, what to expect. First and foremost, you should expect a huge degree of improvement, right? We ask you to do something like 8 QDAFIs, but you'll have 2 QDAFIs that won't even be graded. You'll just get feedback. And this provides you with sort of a platform and an opportunity to benefit and learn from the process, because it is just that. It's a learned skill, it's a trained skill, it's a learning process, and you're going to be supported the entire way. Lastly, you'll get an almost uncomfortably firm grip of the material, right? You're going to be able to interact with these papers as an active consumer and not only learn the material, but also learn how to interact with these papers at sort of a larger, more macro scale. So to be a little bit more specific, what you're actually going to be doing with the QDAFI. So this is an academic research article, and some of you may be more familiar with this than others, but it generally starts out with a title followed by an abstract, the short kind of summary that we discussed. And this is followed by an introduction where the authors are generally trying to tie their current study or motivate their study based on the literature, based on what other people have found, based on current prevalent theories, models, things like this. And that's going to be followed by a method section. Method sections can often be kind of overly technical because a lot of scientists want other scientists to be able to go in and reproduce their work, right? It's a huge issue currently in science, something that we'll also be discussing later. And this is going to be followed by a results section, which can also be kind of computationally heavy, right? Lots of numbers, lots of statistical tests, and especially for those of you that are maybe coming from backgrounds outside of psychology or the natural or social sciences, this might present a bit of a challenge, right? And then that's followed by a discussion section where they kind of wrap up those findings and tie them back into the introduction and into the sort of the literature and theories that already exist. So your job is to take all of this big mess, and this can range, from papers that are one page in length to, 20 to 30 pages in length. Your job is to take that and transform it into this, right? This little half a page summary that really hits home the gist of the paper. So let's zoom in a little bit and talk about what the QDAFI actually means in practice, right? What do these sections mean? What should you be including? What does a good QDAFI look like? So the first section of the QDAFI is the Q. This stands for question. This is essentially the question that the authors were trying to answer. This is arguably one of the most critical components of the QDAFI, if I do say so myself. If you can't identify the question, chances are you won't be able to kind of hit the other points, because everything should be really tied to this initial question that the authors had and that they're trying to answer, right? This is the point of the study. Many authors these days are going to be really, really nice and will actually frame this in the form of a question. but be forewarned because not all authors will. Examples of questions can include something like, how does attention to a stimulus affect how that stimulus is actually represented in the perceptual system and working memory? Whether or not object recognition is faster or more accurate for familiar items, or whether or not individuals maybe combine prior information with new sensory information in an optimal way when they're performing a new task, things like this, right? And this should always be framed in the form of a question when you're writing it up. The best sections of the article to answer this question are generally the abstract and the introduction. Sometimes a little bit in the discussion, authors will revisit their initial question, but generally I would say the introduction is one of the places that I tend to look for when I'm answering this question. The second section is the D section. D stands for do. I think that this is one of the most straightforward aspects of the QDAFI method. So what did the authors actually do in practice, right, to answer this question? You should focus on what the authors manipulated and what the authors measured. So in other words, you should be focusing on the independent variables, right? Like I said, what the authors manipulated or what they changed, and the dependent variables, what they measured, what the outcome was, right? So did the authors change maybe some particular aspect of a stimulus? Maybe they changed the number of items in a sequence. Maybe they changed the setting in which a certain task took place. In essence, what did the authors manipulate and what did the authors measure? Try not to get kind of lost in the sauce. We don't necessarily care about specifics that might be less relevant to the actual question, right? Maybe we don't care about the sample size or the gender distribution or where these participants came from, unless it's directly relevant to the question that the authors were trying to answer. So like I said, you should be trying to focus on the main variables of the study, which are the independent and the dependent variables. And generally, the method section is generally the best place to look for this, but this might also be mentioned in the abstract, right? What did the authors manipulate and what did they measure? That's the key component here. The next section is the A section, or the author's rationale, or the rationale. So what was the general idea behind the study, right? Out of the infinite number of possibilities that the authors could have done to answer this question, why did the authors specifically do what they did in D and not something else? The rationale should kind of link this specific question to the actual methods that the authors used, right? Why? And the best sections of this article to answer the question are generally going to be in the introduction and in the method section, right? Sometimes this will be discussed a little bit in the discussion section, but I would generally try and focus on the introduction and the method section, right? This should be the motivation behind the study. So I come from a computer science background, and it's really easy for me to conceptualize this in terms of an if-then statement, right? If there really exists a link between familiarity and memory, short-term memory recall, then we would expect individuals or participants that are more familiar or have been presented more times with a particular visual stimulus to perform better on a recall task, right? Once again, linking the methods that the authors used with the actual question. The F section is also, I think, probably after the method section, this is probably the next most sort of straightforward section to answer. What did the authors actually find? This can generally be found in the results section, but be warned because the results section can sometimes be a little bit, statistics heavy, computationally heavy, right? So we're asking you to identify the specific relationship that the authors found between the independent variables and the dependent variables, right? So generally, like I said, you can find this in the results section, also a bit in the beginning of the discussion section, but this can be kind of condensed, right? So, for example, the authors found a strong positive correlation between the number of times a participant was exposed to a stimulus, right? So here we're getting at familiarity, and the accuracy and speed at which participants were able to recall information presented in a sequence, right? You're linking the independent and dependent variables, and you're telling us what the relationship between the two was like. And lastly, the I section, which is the interpretation. How do the authors interpret the findings, right? Do the authors interpret the findings in a way that was problematic? And if yes, how so? I will say that most of the papers we're presenting you guys with or giving you to kind of, exercise this method on are, very high impact, high caliber papers. So oftentimes you won't be able to identify kind of, like a fatal flaw in these papers. And that is absolutely, that's okay. That's what we want in science, right? So how do the authors actually interpret the findings? What do they mean in real life? So this is kind of going a step beyond the straight findings, right? Beyond the relationship that authors observed, what does this actually mean in the context of maybe this specific subfield or subdomain of memory that we're discussing, or this specific effect, right, that the authors are investigating? So, for example, findings suggest that familiarity impacts information recall by increasing the number of retrieval cues associated with maybe like a to be remembered object, something like that, right? The best place to find this is generally going to be in the discussion, because that's the point of the discussion, right? The authors are kind of closing that circle, relating what they actually found in their study to what other people have found and to the existing theory that they might be testing or looking at. Okay. So some general take-home notes, larger messages, less is more, right? Please, please, please do not exceed a page. This should be, essentially half a page at maximum. I would say aim for around 2 sentences per section. If you go a little bit over, that's okay. But, if you're going over and doing, 4+ sentences, you will be losing points, right? So that's not what we're looking for. Try and aim for around 140 characters or a tweet per section, right? And there are plenty of examples. There's a full-on example written by Pascal in the QDAFI guide. And then there's also a TLDR version, which is kind of an abbreviated version if you need another sort of second primer. The way that we're going to be grading these, we will be grading these on a sort of score out of 10. So you'll get 2 points per section. And the first point is, are you following the QDAFI format, right? Are you answering the question that you're supposed to be answering? And are you, sticking with this kind of 2 sentences per section guideline? And then the second point will be for content, right? Are you actually, correctly responding with correctly identifying the independent and dependent variables, right? So this is the QDAFI method in a nutshell. Of course, we're always happy to talk more about this, and we will be going over the QDAFI method every week in recitation. We will be going over the QDAFI from the previous week, so you'll have the chance to practice this. And like I said, 2 out of the 8 QDAFIs will not be assigned grade. So we're here to teach you this method because it is such an invaluable method. I have been doing this, like I said, for 6 years. I use it for absolutely everything. When I go to conferences, I'm using the QDAFI method. When I'm doing a literature review, I'm using the QDAFI method. So this is really for your benefit, and we're here to help. So with that, I will sign off, and I will say best of luck, and please, please let us know if you have questions.